Well, hello, everyone. I think we'll just give everyone a few minutes to join. Okay, well, welcome everyone to our webinar on the U.S. automotive industry sector outlook for 2026. We have a panel today. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. We're going to talk about tariff and trade policies, obviously, which are sort of steering a lot of what's happening these days in the automotive industry. We're going to talk about energy transition, both in terms of EVs, and the energy transition in the automotive industry itself, and also the impact of what's happening in energy transition on the U.S. automotive industry, as well as how companies are working through these issues with partnerships, alliances, joint ventures, et cetera, to address these issues. So I will let our panelists introduce themselves. Josh, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Darcy. Good morning, everybody. My name is Josh Gould. I'm a partner in international trade practice at Hogan Lovells, based in Washington, D.C. Based on my practice, been with the firm since 2018, primarily focusing on assisting clients with day-to-day customs, export controls, and sanctions compliance matters, with a particular emphasis on compliance program implementations, assessments, and audits, given my prior background as in-house compliance and regional compliance director, as well as a consultant in global trade practice at Ernst & Young for 5 years. Great to be here with you, everyone, today.
Hello.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm Hillary Kane. I'm Senior Vice President of Policy at Alliance for Automotive Innovation. For those of you joining us who don't know who we are the main trade association for the auto industry here in the United States. So we represent the automakers that make up almost the entire US market, as well as automotive suppliers and technology companies that are working in the automotive space. I run, as the head of policy, I run all of our policy issues, across our entire sort of issue set, but I also am the lead on our work and trade and China policy. So happy to be here, looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. And we have one more panelist who's going to be joining us. He's just dealing with some technical difficulties. So we will let Meyer Patel introduce himself as soon as he gets here. Just a few housekeeping items before we dive in. If you should have all gotten a warning, this video is being recorded, and we will be sending a copy of the recording out to all registered participants after we're finished. We're also going to have about 15 minutes of Q&A after we're finished our initial discussion. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A button. Feel free to submit questions as we're talking, anything that comes up in our discussion or just other topics you're interested in. Happy to address those at the end. All right. Well, maybe we'll get launched. So starting with trade policy, I think it used to be that tariffs and trade policy were mostly seen as an economic control mechanism. What we're seeing increasingly is that they're continuing to be used as an economic control, but also as a strategic national security tool. And that is obviously having a pretty substantial impact on the U.S. auto industry in 2025 and looking into 2026. So, Josh, do you want to start? Maybe what are you seeing in terms of what's new on trade policy, what people are worried about, and what sort of we're going to be reacting to in this first half of 2026?
Yeah, thanks, Darcy. And I think Meyer, when he joins, can speak a bit more on kind of the trade policy, given his prior background in the Senate Finance Committee and kind of his expertise in that space. But I think what we can think about when we look at 2026 and kind of where things are going from a trade policy and tariffs perspective, it's important to kind of think about, I think frame the discussion of where the direction of travel has been over the last year and the frenzy of tariff policy and activity that was implemented beginning last February with tariffs from an IEEPA perspective on China, Mexico, and Canada, with some delayed implementation on Mexico and Canada. And then following on with the Section 232 tariffs, kind of the expansion of the tariffs on for steel and aluminum, kind of globally from the prior 10% since 2018, the removal of exclusions, to a 25% tariff rate on steel and aluminum imports in the United States. And then obviously the automotive finished product, finished vehicles, and the auto parts tariffs that came into play in March, and then the reciprocal tariffs in April of last year. And so kind of the direction of travel since then, if you look and specifically kind of prioritized looking at the automotive sector, it has been obviously the uptick from 25% in March, some carve outs for parts from a USMCA perspective in that March timeframe. But since then, the flurry of investigations that started in March and April timeframe from a Section 232 perspective has somewhat slowed in terms of the implementation or kind of the scope of the tariffs that have been put in place as a result. And so you see kind of the recent critical minerals Section 232 was narrower in scope in terms of really just not announcing any tariffs at all, really kicking the policy to 180 days for the administration to investigate or determine kind of agreements that it could reach with partners similar to what we had in place with the US and Australia to identify critical minerals. And similarly, what you saw with the semiconductors 232 investigation, where the announcement really was narrower in focus and primarily looking at some NVIDIA and AMD semiconductor advanced computing chips that would be imported and subject to a 25% tariff as part of the export licensing regime that was put in place around those products. And when you look then kind of that's kind of indicates some of the slowdown or kind of maybe a little bit narrower scope that goes to some of the affordability or midterm considerations that I think we think the administration may be considering. And then looking specifically at the automotive space, the direction of travel really since that March timeframe has been somewhat of a paring down or kind of while still significant tariffs, a bit of a paring down in the sense that you had 25% kind of across the board, but then you have trade agreements with countries, strategic trade partners like the UK, 10% tariff rates, the EU, 25% for vehicles and parts. Similarly, Japan at 15%. And then you look even the most recent tariff agreement we saw with India, which remains to be put in place, but would have auto parts subject to a quota at 18%. And so a little bit of a paring back in terms of some of the impacts of the tariffs. And this is also seen with the tariff import offset program the administration put in place last year, which goes to the priority of domestic manufacturing and production of finished vehicles and allows those companies that are engaged in that activity to use that as an offset based on, at the time, a 3.75% assessment of the full aggregate MSRP of vehicles produced in the United States as an offset against Section 232 tariff liability for auto parts. And that could then be passed along both to the importer itself as well as its vendors to reduce the impact of the increase in costs subject to vendors providing increased costs on their products to the OEM as a result of the tariffs. And that in turn was expanded in October, November last year to extend not just for the 1 to 2 year time frame originally was put in place, but to 2030 at that 3.75% tariff rate. And so that expansion, I think, goes to the point of kind of addressing some of the affordability costs and impacts on the final value of vehicles in the United States. And the kind of the last point I'll just raise on that kind of angle is what we saw with the November medium heavy duty truck proclamation announcement, which included an expansion in effect of the scope of that import offset program to allow for repair after sales parts to be included, as well as a clarification that parts that are, USMCA eligible or that are not subject to they get effectively a 0% tariff rate because they're USMCA eligible or they have a 0% rate as a result of the import offset credit, don't fall into the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariff liability. Whereas before, the prior guidance from CBP and the administration had been that if you have parts that are subject to both the auto tariffs and the Section 232 steel and aluminum, and you have a part that's USMCA qualifying and therefore gets 0% under the auto 232s, it falls into the steel and aluminum 232s. And so this was a clarification that allowed those parts to continue to be imported duty-free going forward rather than have the 50% tariff liability from a steel and aluminum perspective. And so I think what we've seen is from a policy, somewhat of pulling back or reduction in some of the impact liability or impact tariff liability in some of these spaces. But the wild card in this obviously is the IEEPA case before the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court decides that IEEPA is not an appropriate measure for the use of tariffs, does that increase the tariff exposure from a Section 232, either in the auto space or the pending robotics 232 investigation or others that could impact the industry going forward.
I have some follow-up questions for you, but I see Meyer joined us. So Meyer, could you just briefly introduce yourself, a little bit of your background and what you work on here at Hogan Lovells?
Sure, I'm Meyer Patel. I've been with Hogan Lovells since last July. Before that, I was the Chief International Trade Counsel for the Senate Finance Committee Republicans. I had been doing that job for about 5 years. I started when we were working on USMCA's passage, the Implementation Act through Congress. So was extremely glad to work under Chairman Grassley to get that done, and then under Senator Crapo to work on many of the implementation issues. Before that, I had been at USTR for several years doing dispute settlement and trade negotiations, including USMCA, the chapters on technical barriers to trade, good regulatory practices, and a lot of the sectoral outcomes.
And so I think you heard some of what Josh said. It sounds like, Josh, from your perspective, there's reason for cautious optimism as we head into 2026, that maybe some of the doom and gloom of 2025, it's looking like things aren't quite as broad or catastrophic as sort of thought. Meyer, what are your thoughts on that? What are you seeing?
I definitely think that there's reason to be optimistic, but I would also highlight there will be challenges. And, I thought maybe this is a good place maybe to segue a little bit into USMCA, for an example. I think the general conventional wisdom is that we will get a successful USMCA joint review. Now, I think there are good reasons to believe that is the case, but it's not guaranteed by any long shot. I think, there is a view among some folks who think the administration will have to, at the end of the day, either agree to USMCA or at worst, they'll agree not to extend USMCA, but it won't expire. I don't share that sentiment. I do think that there is a reasonable possibility that if we don't see progress that are important to the administration, that not only will you not see its renewal at the end of the joint review, but you could see in the fall a possible withdrawal from USMCA. I think a lot of folks consistently say, well, with USMCA, we've had exceptions for qualifying products. We saw that with the IEEPA tariffs. We've seen that. I think post midterms, they're going to see opportunities to say, well, did we make progress after we've done a joint review and it wasn't successful? And if not, do we decide to go with two separate agreements? And the administration's number one priority is making sure that the trade deficit goes down. And that will be a difficult thing to achieve here. Now, I think the optimism is a lot of issues that weren't sorted out with USMCA the first time. There are opportunities to engage. This is a kind of a high risk, high reward situation. I think a lot of folks know that auto rules of origin, extremely contentious issue. What went wrong the first time? I think the first time, if you ask a lot of stakeholders, the engagement advocacy presented some difficulties. They thought they had understandings with the administration on what those rules of origin would look like. For example, super core roll-up. And it didn't really come to pass when we had implementation. There's been a lot of investment. By a lot of measures, USMCA should be viewed as a success. Interregional trade grew up 37%. But that trade deficit went up too. And I think they're going to be looking at how do we use rules of origin in a manner. But there are ways to think about it, increasing ways to do this with runways, things about making sure that we have safe harbors, making sure that the investments that have been done through USMCA today are still rewarded, that I think are important. I think the administration shares the goal of making sure there is reshoring. And they also want to make sure that those efforts aren't disrupted. But that involves getting in front of them and also showing them the data. And I think that's something that's difficult for folks. We're used to engaging even at a detail level with career staff, only a certain amount. This administration, when you negotiate, or at least try to engage with them, they really want to get into the numbers. They really want to get into the investment details. And that's a more difficult ask, but that is something that you can work with them on. And if you show them, look, this is how we would increase North American investment, and it's particularly US investment, make sure that improves security, you can do that. The other thing is this USMCA review is also going to talk about national security as well. And I think that's a dynamic that people don't necessarily appreciate. They think of it in just limited of, well, are we going to prevent Chinese EVs from entering the market? We also need to think about, they're going to be thinking about border security. They're going to be thinking about fentanyl. Now, the good news is while those issues are very difficult and pose real risks, they can also address a lot of industry asks. If you get border security, you can also talk about improving customs clearances with Mexico, making sure that commercial trade moves faster. So I think those are real opportunities here to engage with the administration and really making sure that the supply chain is stronger at the end of the joint review than it was before.
And Hillary, I know the national security topic is one you have thought about a lot. What's your sort of take on how to approach these issues from a national security perspective and how to work with the administration?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And what I think, we've talked everything so far that Josh and Meyer have talked about is obviously front and center for the industry right now. But I also want to bring China in. We talked a little, I think there were hints of China, but I think when you're talking about national security, auto industry, and trade, we can't have a conversation without talking about China. So there's a couple of things that are front and center right now for the auto industry with respect to China and trade. The first is the Bureau of Industry and Security's new connected vehicle rule takes effect next month. So we're a little under 4 weeks out from the first prohibitions taking effect. And for those who haven't been tracking this closely, this is obviously, or not obviously, it's essentially a prohibition on the use of Chinese and Russian, although there's not much Russian content to be worried about, but Chinese content in vehicle connectivity systems and automated driving systems in vehicles for sale in the United States. And all things considered, I would argue that this is one of the most significant regulations that the auto industry has seen in decades. It's unlike anything the industry's ever had to do before, get visibility into awareness of supply chains at an unprecedented level, and to make changes and adjustments to ensure that there isn't that Chinese or Russian content. We're, as I mentioned, we're staring down on the first compliance deadlines. I think things are getting very real for folks right now. There are still some open questions and some ambiguity that I think needs to be resolved here in the next several weeks as we look at that first deadline. The second thing I'll flag that I'm hearing a lot about from our companies relative to China is concerns about what we're seeing take place with mass exports of automobiles from Chinese automakers. So folks may be aware that China is now the largest vehicle exporter in the world. And that's the result of sort of very focused efforts to grow their global market share and to essentially dominate global automaking going forward. We have seen the Chinese OEMs, the Chinese automakers make really significant inroads in markets all around the world, South America, Southeast Asia. There was a recent announcement, obviously, in Canada that they are going to allow, I think, up to 49,000 Chinese vehicles into their market. And so there's a lot of concern about what that would mean for the U.S. auto industry if the Chinese OEMs were able to get access to the U.S. market. There are restrictions in place now. There's tariff barriers. The connected vehicle rule I just talked about is a barrier, but there's a lot of concern and heartburn, I would say, within the industry about the possibility of those automakers getting access to the market. And I'll just maybe make one last point on this. It's not about competition. It's about the fact that these companies tend to be heavily subsidized by the Chinese Communist Party. They tend to sell their products at below market prices. So it's not, sort of a fair competition type scenario. It's folks coming in with the intent to sort of dominate and control the market.
Well, they're also looking at a very different level of regulation. Is that right? When Chinese automakers are designing a new product.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, if they were to come into the U.S. market, they would need to meet U.S. Safety regulations and environmental regulations and that sort of thing. But yeah, they have certainly a different approach in China than we see in the U.S., which would be a barrier for them.
So, and we had sort of on this topic, we had a question from the audience. And maybe Hillary, I'll pose this first to you, but Josh, Meyer, interested in your thoughts as well. Will the divergence of U.S. vehicle regulations become a handicap for exports and technology investment into the U.S.?
Meyer, did you want to jump in here, or do you want me to go?
I can start. Honestly, I think there's a lot of opportunity here. To me, FMVSS standards, historically we've had challenges, especially with the European Union pushing, UN standards around the world. If you'd asked me, the last administration we put this under the rubric of technical barriers to trade. And they had told me quite candidly in the Biden administration, we don't want to do anything on this front. We think it's a sovereignty issue. And frankly, we like other countries' systems better. We feel they regulate better. And it was a really uncomfortable conversation. And the irony was, on both sides of the hill, people were saying, maybe you don't want to say that out loud. But this administration kind of takes the different perspective. They're like, we want US standards to be global standards. And that's just not related to AI. That's to the industrial sector too. I think one of the things you'll see is in a lot of these trade agreements, there is a second part where they realize, look, to get the trade deficit down, we have to increase US exports. And that means that US regulatory standards have to become global standards. Or at least there has to be a pathway for equivalence. So you're going to see when they say, okay, if we improve US auto exports, we just can't have a system where at the end of the day, they're going to say, look, US standards don't work. You have to do UN standards, or you have to have a separate production line. I think I've met with multiple policymakers who have told me, yeah, it's just not getting the tariff down. Yes. For example, the EU, yes, they have their 10% auto tariff. We have all these other issues in third markets, but unless we get them to accept US standards, we're not going to have this. And cars, between the technology and EV and all these other challenges, they really do see an opportunity here to push US standards as global standards and also create commitments that will facilitate adoption, making sure that we have a pathway for equivalence. So I see real opportunities there.
Yeah, and I'll just add, certainly harmonization of standards, could help reduce, technical barriers to trade into the US, but I would also just note that it could help also address technical barriers to trade exporting out of the US and into other markets, right? So I think it's a little bit of a two-sided coin there, in that certainly there are companies that are producing vehicles in the US that would like to export those vehicles to overseas markets as well. And harmonization could be an enabler of that.
Josh, you had talked earlier about the offsets available for Section 232 for domestic manufacturing. Do you see that as a credible sort of path forward for reshoring? Is that really just going to be an offset, or do you think that effectively can work to catalyze domestic manufacture on a larger scale?
Yeah, I think in the construct of this being a basis for really onshoring would be difficult because of the time frame in which it's available is only 3 years. Doesn't have a certainty kind of going forward into the 5-10 year time frame that a lot of companies would want to see in terms of being able to make those large scale commitments to domestic production. I think as well that the basis for it only being an offset against your auto parts tariff liability and not other potential tariff liability or other potential taxes or investment costs in the United States is another impediment to this being a real basis or driver for domestic onshoring. I think it could be one piece of the overall architecture in which domestic onshoring is made more palatable and more feasible from an economic perspective. But I think in and of itself, it provides a mechanism to lower the in near-term burden on companies and importers as they ramp up domestic production, or at least provide an offset, no pun intended, obviously, in terms of the ability for these existing manufacturers of automotive vehicles in the United States to not be unduly burdened by the tariffs that have been imposed under Section 232.
Do you think that BIS rules could play a different role there because they do have a more substantial sort of escalating effect? Is that right, Hillary or others?
Yeah, I would defer to Meyer or Josh on that. I don't know. I'm not a super expert on BIS. Other than the connected vehicle rule, I could talk to you about that at nauseum. The rest of it, I'll defer to the expert.
Yeah, Darcy, when you refer to the BIS rules, are you referring to the ICTS connected vehicle rules, or what were you in that context? Yeah, so I think that the connected vehicle rule, because it really is targeted specifically at VCS and ADS, VCS hardware and software, and ADS software that's designed, developed, engineered, maintained, et cetera, by entities in China or Russia. And so really the focus is on China. I think from a larger perspective, it doesn't have enough of an impact to really enable or level the playing field for domestic manufacturing in the U.S. relative to other non-Chinese markets. I think it really is a national security consideration based on Chinese development of the VCS and ADS components and software that they don't want imported in the United States. It doesn't create a limitation or kind of in the export control world. It doesn't create a long arm jurisdiction to limit Chinese manufacture of those parts and components to other markets in the world. It really is just a domestic import limitation. So it can be a benefit to kind of limit the Chinese imports in the United States of these types of vehicles. But in terms of domestic manufacturing more broadly, or for exports of the U.S. vehicles outside the United States, I think it doesn't have much of an impact in that regard.
Yeah, and sorry, I misunderstood your question, Darcy, but I will jump in since we are talking about the connected vehicle rule. One thing I do think is very interesting is there was, when the rule was under development and first being implemented, there was a lot of interest within the previous administration trying to advance similar structures in other parts of the world. There was a lot of outreach to Europe and Canada and Asia about them adopting similar regulations, which I just think is an interesting observation. We haven't seen as much of that in this administration, although I think more recently there's been some conversation about, going back to the dialogue about USMCA a few minutes ago, about maybe thinking about utilizing USMCA as a way to get some alignment or harmonization across Canada, Mexico, and the US about their approach to Chinese components and vehicles, or alternatively to use USMCA as a way to ensure that neither Mexico or Canada become a backdoor into the United States for Chinese components or Chinese completed vehicles.
That makes sense. Just another question that came in. So China announced yesterday that it has put a restriction on Chinese EV OEMs from exporting vehicles below cost, potentially having some impact on the price wars. How do you see that evolving in the China export story and competitiveness for US/North American industry? Meyer, do you have thoughts on that one?
I mean, I do think you need to take into the context of China's kind of geostrategic rapprochement with the various countries here, but it's also from their interests. They are worried that countries are going to bring more dumping cases against Chinese vehicles. The reality is, even if it's not at below cost, these vehicles are extremely cheap and cost efficient. I think, they're trying to signal, well, don't bring dumping cases against us. We are going to try and create a price floor in a certain way, or we're not going to engage in dumping. Now, whether other countries will accept that, that's a different matter. But I think around the world, people are looking at these cars and saying, look, the only way they're getting at these prices is through subsidies and through dumping. And they're telling the EU, look, you brought your anti-subsidy investigation. We're willing to try to negotiate on that. And we're showing a commitment right now that if on the dumping side, we won't sell below this cost. Now, whether other countries will accept that, I'm a little skeptical, candidly, because I think the reality is, even with that commitment, you're still going to see cars that have still benefited from subsidies. And frankly, a lot of their increased market share, you can't unwind that immediately by saying, okay, well, we're not going to stop dumping anymore. The reality is people are going to say, well, what about the last few years? There's a reason you've become so competitive here. I think that's really going to have an impact on how they respond to that. But I do think some countries will say, okay, maybe there's at least they're willing to show some engagement. Should we talk more? Should we talk about Canada-style deals?
Yeah, and I'll just add too, I mean, if you look at the Chinese capacity for vehicle production right now, I think if my numbers are still accurate, that they've got the capacity to build right now, current capacity to build 20 million more vehicles than their domestic market supports. So the success of these companies isn't completely reliant and dependent on an export strategy. They have to find a place for those 20 million vehicles to go. They're going to figure out how to get their exports, in whatever way, some way, somehow they will get there, because they depend on that export strategy going forward.
Yep. And Hillary, this is maybe another one for you. Have you heard that the connected vehicle rule is up for negotiation during the president's visit to China?
I have not heard that. So I would be interested if somebody else has. I will say, I mean, one thing we talked about the fact that the rule essentially, there's a lot of elements of the rule. We don't need to go into all the details, but one thing that it does do also is prohibit Chinese automakers or Russian automakers from selling connected or automated vehicles in the US, period. So if, for example, the president were to agree to let a Chinese automaker manufacture in the United States as part of this trade deal, which is something that I think we've all heard is not outside the realm of possibility. There would need to be a specific authorization granted to a Chinese automaker to be able to then sell the vehicles that it would make at that US facility. So maybe it's a roundabout way. I'm just speculating, right? But if there's ton conversations about this being a topic, it could be what sort of exemption or specific authorization would need to be issued to make that sort of deal or element of a deal come together.
Okay, well, I think we could probably talk about trade for a full hour. I'm guessing when we turn back to Q&A, a lot of this will come up again, but I do want to make sure we have time to talk about an issue near and dear to my heart, which is energy transition, both in terms of EVs in the automotive industry, and then also how the broader energy transition in the US is impacting and coming alongside the automotive industry in terms of issues like critical minerals, battery sourcing, et cetera. So I'm just interested, Meyer, from your perspective. I think we've talked a lot about trade policy, but there's also been quite a bit of movement in terms of tax credits impacting both EVs and energy components that, compete with EVs, like critical minerals and batteries. What are you seeing there as we move into 2026? Do you think that's going to get quieter now that we sort of have Treasury guidance for OB3? Or do you think we're just getting started on rolling out what that's really going to look like?
I think to me, there's going to be, the nice thing is there is some guidance now. I think people have been searching that for a long time, but I would encourage everyone to submit comments before the March 30th deadline. There's going to be regulations. But importantly, I would start with what we don't know yet from the guidance. To me, yes, we all expected a proposal and it's guidance. It's not supposed to be finalized. But to me, there were some key areas where I was like, what about licensing agreements? What about debt with foreign entities? How does that fall in within, prohibited foreign entities? And that's going to be something that's really important. The interesting thing is, on one hand, while there is an effort to say, look, we want to keep Chinese EVs out, there's the other part, which is saying China has a lot of technology that we need to kind of work with them on some areas, on batteries and technologies, and figuring out how, prohibited foreign entry or FIAC, works is going to be one of the critical areas here. And that, to me, licensing was one of the key ones where, open-ended question here. Now, like I said, I think there was some good elements here. I think guidance was, pretty comprehensive in some areas. I think, obviously everybody would want everything spelled out to the T, but I thought we really made some clarity on material assistance, trying to figure out, look, what is the credit for a facility if there's an excessive percentage? I thought that, the safe harbor identifications were really helpful. So I think there is some good work here, but there are a lot of unanswered questions, and that's all the more reason to engage right now, take advantage of the common opportunity, take that advantage to engage with the Treasury about this. So, like I said, I think there is some clarity. For those who want to go back to the old EV tax credit, that's not happening. I think you have to look at the broader, administration position on this. But if you take a look at other tax credits and what they'll have for manufacturing and things that will impact, the auto industry, we do need to kind of get some clarity on some key points. And I think there's time to work with the administration on getting that clarity to figure out, what the investment plans over the next several years are going to look like.
Yeah. And I think what we've seen on the transactional side is a lot of sort of formal joint ventures, but also sort of informal, strategic contractual relationships being developed in a way that is sort of flexible and allows for the structure to shift in response to final fiat guidance as it comes out. Because I think both in the energy industry and in the auto industry, you're right, there is Chinese intellectual property that we just need in order to even set up the correct domestic manufacturing in order to, get to where we want to land. I'm wondering, does anyone have thoughts on sort of how labor issues flow into that? How we get the actual people that we need for learning how to do this domestically, learning how to do the domestic manufacturing that we need?
I think looking at the administration's sensitivity on immigration, it is going to be challenging. But I do think that, one of the interesting things was, after you saw, the raid in Georgia, you saw President Trump saying, look, we do need to upscale our workforce. So there may be people coming here for a time. There is bills been introduced on the Hill to talk about this issue. I think, will it be something that can be done before the midterms? I don't know. I hope this could be a potentially bipartisan issue right now. My sense from engaging with some folks on the Hill is there, any type of bipartisanship right now is extremely challenging, particularly on things that might involve visas. But there's a sense that there has to be some degree of upscaling. There's particularly a lot of the investments that are being announced right now. You just saw the first series of Japan investments announced yesterday. There are thoughts about how to get people here who can help and do the upscaling of our workforce to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I not on workforce, but I do think it's something that we should talk about or address is, so there, in addition to sort of the FIAC regulations and guidance out of Treasury, there's also been a lot of interest and focus out of Department of Commerce on, Section 232 on critical minerals and things like that, right? Which is still open-ish. Who knows what's coming next there? But it's interesting to me because obviously, we've seen the EV market in the US sort of materialize a lot slower than I think we all anticipated was going to be the case a number of years ago. And so that being said, my companies are still pursuing electrification just at a slower clip than we had seen in the past. And that I think opens itself up to a conversation about, can we use this time, whatever this time is, right, with this, or the slower transition, to sort of work on building out the domestic supply chains, or at least the non-foreign adversary supply chains for critical minerals that are needed to support this transition over the long term. And so what we've seen, the administration, at least initially, focused mostly on was sort of the stick side of it. The 232, we're going to put, tariffs on these minerals coming in from China or elsewhere. And now I think we're seeing, and I mean, Josh and Meyer, you could disagree with me, or like a little bit of a shift into the less sticks and more carrots, right? Trying to create these policies and strategic reserves and get, mining deals signed and things like that, so that we can start to see the critical mineral supply chain develop in the United States to be there to support the EV transition of the future. And so I just think it's an interesting thing to observe and comment on, and a little bit of a shift that I've seen over the last several months out of the administration.
And it does seem like this is an area where the energy industry and the automotive industry are able to sort of complement one another. So as the transition to EVs has slowed somewhat, the need for utility scale energy storage systems to support grid stability for data centers and AI has just skyrocketed. So it seems like we continue to need the massive amounts of critical minerals that we thought we would. It's just in the short term, more of them are being used for energy projects, fewer for EVs. But I do think it seems like that's going to help in that we'll have that domestic capability more ready by the time the automotive industry needs them.
I think that's right. And I also just think an important point, I think I saw a question roll into the chat as well, or the Q&A as well, that I think there is this misperception that the auto industry only needs critical minerals for EVs. That is not true. EVs certainly need more critical minerals than ICE vehicles do, but there are critical mineral needs in auto that go beyond EVs. And I think, as we saw with the rare earth magnet issue last spring, that there are a lot of motors and vehicles that anyway, there are things that require critical minerals beyond electrification. So this is a strategic need for the industry, regardless of sort of how the EV market develops over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Thank you. That's a very helpful clarity. I'll be honest, I forget that one myself. So I think just moving on to partnerships, joint ventures, what we've seen some of is automotive companies in the automotive industry partnering with those in the energy industry in order to address this sort of joint need for critical minerals and domestic onshoring. Is that something that you all have seen in your areas?
Yeah, I'll start just to fill the silence. I mean, yes, yeah. So I think, I mean, I'll just start by saying that whether we're talking about the electrification transition, whether we're talking about connectivity, whether we're talking about automation, whether we're talking about software-defined vehicles, like there is a lot of very capital-intensive transitions that are underway all at once in the auto industry. This is a very transformational time for the industry. And like I said, all of those transformations are very capital intensive. And so what I've been seeing at least is a lot of interest in both horizontal and vertical sort of partnerships to help share those costs, distribute those costs among various partners and players in order to realize sort of the technology and the vision. So software-defined vehicles is certainly a space where we've seen a lot of sort of vertical integration. We've seen partnerships horizontally, with different OEMs trying to come together on electrification. Autonomous vehicles is another space where I think a lot of the OEMs don't feel like they can go that alone. So they're looking for partners either horizontally or vertically to help them.
Okay.
Add to that, I mean, less so from the energy transition perspective, but is more so from a supply chain perspective as companies look to address the impacts of tariffs and supply chain generally in the automotive space. Is you've seen companies work outside of the JV context, but just more vendor, OEM, supplier relationships, looking to kind of manage the tariff impacts collectively to where there are business relationships, long-term relationships where that makes sense and the supply chain relationship kind of requires that long-term investment or commitment to rebalance the impact of the tariffs, whether it's looking at kind of sharing the impact of the tariff liability between business partners to reduce the impact on downstream customers, whether it's considering alternative supply chain arrangements to consider what, in context of automotive parts, is your supplier able to consider manufacturing or production given existing bases or ability to transition quickly to produce the automotive parts in Canada or Mexico and be USMCA qualifying, and therefore reduce the tariff liability potentially to zero. Additionally, considering where there might be opportunities to look at modifying or tariff engineering, which obviously is a viable and appropriate compliance mechanism, tariff engineering to consider what is the tariff classification of the parts that are being provided by a vendor, such that you might have a steel or aluminum part or component that's subject to Section 232 at a 50% level. But for the processing and manufacturing, perhaps not too much would be required to modify that part into an automotive part, subject to Section 232 auto tariffs, and therefore removing the liability from a 50% tariff to 25% tariff liability. So looking at kind of collaboratively considering the relationships between OEMs, intermediate manufacturers, and the suppliers to think about how to reduce the overall impact of tariffs across the supply chain is something we've seen companies take into account as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, I think I do want to leave time for Q&A, so I'm just going to spin through. We've gotten some great questions. First, someone asked, we're following the efforts of automakers to make EVs that appeal to mass market price points. What are you seeing in this arena and what should we watch?
I don't know if I have anything, insightful to add here. I mean, I think everybody is trying to figure this out, right? There, as I said earlier, the market hasn't materialized the way folks thought. Folks are rejiggering and recalibrating and figuring out what the future looks like. There's certainly an intersection or a conversation going on about the intersection between electrification and affordability and sort of where those two cross and how to meet, make an EV and sell an EV that is, more accessible to a more accessible price point to most people. But I don't I don't know. I think we're all sort of holding our breath and waiting to see how this develops and evolves over the next couple of years as companies recalibrate.
Side note on that, are you seeing as our sort of timeline for electrification shifts, are you seeing more focus on hybrid plug-in hybrid vehicles as opposed to pure EVs?
Yeah, that seems to be folks are looking at that as sort of a place to go, right? To put their energy and efforts. Sorry, puns. Let's puns aplenty. Put their energy, in the nearer term. As again, we wait for, and I will say, I mean, I think there people are recognizing that maybe one of the challenges to the market materializing is sort of consumer familiarity, consumer acceptance, and maybe plug-in hybrids are sort of a bridge, right, between what customers are used to now and what we're hoping they can get used to for the future. So,
Okay. Next question. Tariff agreements seem to be variable from the U.S. perspective. How does this help investment and business certainty, for example, in South Korea?
Well, I mean, I think the view of the administration is the best way to get certainty is just to invest in the United States if you want certainty. If you're going to invest in other countries and rely on them, you're going to have a risk that the administration may take enforcement actions. That said, I do think that certainty improves after you get the trade agreement to some degree. I know with South Korea, people are saying, well, the president made a new threat, but part of that is related to the implementation of that agreement. As you get closer to implementation and when you get this locked down, there will be a little bit more certainty, not perfect certainty, but a little bit more that, look, we have at least an understanding for the next few years. I think one of the challenges we'll have is these are being done as executive agreements. So that is one dynamic. But, right now with the EU, I think there's going to be a real good question with the parliament putting in conditions on the deal. Yeah, you will see the administration say, well, we're not sure there's going to be, you're holding up your side of the deal. And then we may have to rethink what the tariffs are. The tariffs that we're agreeing to lower are based on implementation. I think that's one of the things you're going to have to factor in. The other thing that will impact variability is how the Supreme Court rules on IEEPA. Now, the administration has plenty of authorities to do tariffs, but none are as quick as IEEPA. So if you start having to use other tools, the Supreme Court says IEEPA is not available. We'll see. I think there is a chance the Supreme Court holds IEEPA. We'll find out soon, hopefully. But things like 301, 232 are more process-based. So that provides a little bit more of a window into seeing, well, look, the tariff changes, if they happen, they won't happen, within a single day. They'll happen over, a period of time.
Someone asked, is the U.S. auto industry subsidized by federal and state governments? I really subsidized is quite a loaded term. Does anyone want to address that one?
As a former USTR attorney, I'd say absolutely not. Look, I mean, I think everybody tries to do an industry that provides a healthy competitive environment. And some people will argue, look, when you give a state tax credit for manufacturing, that is a subsidy. But are these subsidies different than what we generally do for encouraging good investment in states? Things, sure, the EV tax credit, people will say that is, a benefit to an industry, but it's nothing on the scale that you see coming out of other countries. And I think that's something really to factor in here. And I think the sheer dynamic, we aren't doing the level of industrial policy to make national champions like other countries have. And I think that's a very important factor to distinguish.
Next question. Can someone talk about services and the implications for trade? For example, Waymo recently revealed that it uses call centers abroad to support riders. Does this run afoul of either trade or security controls?
I mean, from an import perspective, that trade, electronic transmissions, things like that are not subject to import, so that there's no kind of liability or potential implications from an import tariff perspective. From a national security angle as well, wouldn't see that being the use of a call center abroad as a national security implication. Though there are circumstances, when you think about some of the executive orders issued during the last administration related to data centers and requirements for data centers to provide kind of information regarding their end users and ownership information. There is an angle in which things like that's more kind of angled towards data centers with large, advanced computing capabilities and things of that nature and clusters rather than, call support centers, where that could be a concern. And you could have national security implications and potential controls on things of that nature. But I think call center support would not, from my perspective, wouldn't run into trade considerations. And from a national security perspective, is unlikely to be an area where you'd have regulations or controls put in place.
Anyone else have thoughts on that one? Okay. Next question, someone asked, can anyone provide any insight into Nexperia and the BIS affiliates rule, China, the Dutch government, and where this is headed?
So on the affiliates rule, as everyone will recall, that was kind of the announcement that the BIS's entity list was expanding to include, not only those entities specifically identified in the entity list, but any that is owned or controlled 50% or more by such entities on BIS's entity list. And BIS entity list is a list that the Bureau of Industry and Security, the Commerce Department issues to restrict items subject to the AR to such entities. That many of them have been added over the last several years, particularly in China. And so the affiliates rule was kind of viewed, I think, in some media areas as a direct kind of impact on Chinese companies and businesses because of the large number of owner-controlled entities in China that would be effectively shadow BI's entity list parties. And so this, from the administration's perspective, based on reporting, was viewed as a technical correction or technical alignment with the opposite of foreign asset controls 50% rule in the sanction space. But it was, given the breadth of it, viewed as a big kind of change in U.S. policy towards China. And so China immediately reacted. And this was the resulting, I think it was in November, the negotiations between U.S. and China on trade more generally to put the BIS affiliates rule on hold, as well as China's kind of corresponding export controls on rare earth minerals and commodities on hold, the export licensing policy. And so that's a 1-year delay to November 9th or so of 2026, in which time the BIS affiliates rule will, absent further regulatory change, come into effect. And similar kind of the Chinese export control rule would come into effect on rare earth minerals. So I think it remains to be seen where this goes. And I think it's subject to the April meeting that President Trump will have with Xi in China as to where negotiations are on the affiliates rule and the export controls on rare earth minerals. But that's kind of the background on where things are headed. But I think long-term, folks kind of view the BIS entity list rule and the distinction between OFAC as one that may get modified over time anyway to align the two agencies' views on the scope of their end user restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to speculate on where, sort of where things are going to go on this, but I will just say, I mean, the Nexperia challenge that we faced at the end of last year, the rare earth magnet shortage that we talked about from last spring. I will just say, I mean, it is like one thing after another for the auto industry right now in terms of, these supply chain disruptions and challenges. And there are intersections in some cases to government policies, and in other cases, there's not. It's a very fragile supply chain. I think we're all see that and aware of that. And it's been, one hit after after another. And Nexperia was no fun for the companies for sure.
I think next question, is there a version of the connected vehicle standard that applies to technologies other than vehicles like phones and computers?
So there currently is not a connected, ICTS has not imposed rules on things beyond connected vehicles. There's a pending notice of proposed rulemaking related to unmanned aerial systems or drones. And so that has not been implemented yet. Previously, there was a restriction ICTS put in place on Kaspersky Software. That's a Russian-based company on software. And so those, to date, the Kaspersky and the connected vehicle rule are the two restrictions that have been imposed under the ICTS regulations. And drones would likely be the next. But we haven't seen anything specific to other industry or other product sectors yet from an ICTS perspective.
Yeah, I'll add that I'm aware that BIS, and I think this is public knowledge, BIS has or had, I don't know which one it is, a long-term sort of rulemaking roadmap under their ICTS authority. And they had, sort of mapped out where they wanted to go over the next several years. As Josh said, drones was on their commercial vehicles. They did not address commercial vehicles in the connected vehicle rules. They were going to do a separate rulemaking on sort of trucks and buses and things like that. And then there were a number of other areas. The roadmap was expansive. Again, I think there is some rethinking going on right now within the department and within the administration about this authority and sort of how to use it going forward. So I don't know if that's being reconsidered at this point, but yeah, as Josh said, right now it's just us. It's just the connected vehicle rule that's out there.
Next question, what considerations, if any, are being taken for deemed exports or technology transfers under the EAR in light of this administration's trade stance? Will guidance, licensing, or exemptions be forthcoming in light of or in relation to the CV rule?
So the connected vehicle rule and the restrictions it poses kind of on imports in the United States is related to, but not directly in line with kind of EAR restrictions on the exports of technology or software, since it's kind of more inbound. And you don't have deemed export restrictions writ large on ADS or connected vehicle systems technologies under the EAR, like you would kind of for the inbound activities under the connected vehicle rules. And so I don't know outside of the advanced computing space, the kind of advanced chips and the technology related to there, and the rescission of the AI diffusion rule that came out from the administration last year with the press release. I'm not kind of thinking of anything that off the top of mind that is a modification or change to the deemed export or deemed technology rules under the EAR that relate directly to kind of or align with the overall tariff trade stance on creating, tariff import restrictions through tariffs and Section 232 investigations, et cetera. But I think it's an interesting question in the automotive space because, there are products or technologies, certain sensors or other, cameras that can be sensitive in nature in the automotive space that do have deemed export restrictions, but those go back, prior to the Trump administration existing in the EAR. So I think it's an interesting question, but I can't think of anything that aligns kind of deemed export restrictions with the administration's kind of import restrictive trade stance.
I think we're about at time. Just one last question for each of the panelists. What is one thing that is sort of top of your mind, what you're watching out for, waiting to hear, waiting to come, anything like that in 2026? What news is it that you're really waiting to hear? Meyer, maybe thoughts from you?
To me, I think it will be, what shakes out of the Xi-Trump messaging on China. I think, that will have implications, I think, down the line for other trade deals, even USMCA. If we're at the end of the year and we think, look, the relationship is going to be more confrontational, then you're going to see stringent measures on the security side. You're going to see more efforts to increase cooperation, more export controls, more of that. Conversely, if the relationship is better, then I think that also changes the dynamic where you might say, look, are we going to see more room to engage in joint ventures with China? Are we going to be allowed to do more licensing? Are we going to see more Chinese investment in the United States? I mean, between these two barometers, there is a big gap. And I think that's one of the dynamics right now. I think the Trump administration has left itself maximum flexibility. So that's the one big one. I'm kind of curious to see how it shakes out. But I do think, looking at who's negotiating, you'll probably see guideposts after each meeting about where they're heading toward or what progress they're taking stock of.
Hillary, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would associate myself with much of what Meyer said, but I would say USMCA, how this all shakes out is something that the auto companies are closely tracking and monitoring.
And I would just, I think, agree with Meyer's comments and Hillary's on this point. I think the only other one I would add is kind of maybe potentially more near term is the IEEPA case. And while they're not directly impactful for the automotive sector per se, because a lot of your parts are within Section 232 investigations already, I think it can have an indirect impact on Section 232s going forward and either the rebroadening of the scope of the automotive steel aluminum 232s in terms of what's in and what exemptions exist. As well as the robotics 232 that's pending that could impact kind of the CNC machines that are used in factories in the automotive space. Does that, if the Supreme Court says IEEPA is not a mechanism for imposing tariffs in this way, does the administration look at kind of broadening some of the 232 investigations like the robotics one to impact more of those products that would otherwise be coming in to the United States for production automotive mobiles and parts and components.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you all for joining us. Just a reminder to everyone, we'll be sending out a recording, so if you missed anything, you will have it in your inbox. And thank you all very much for joining us.
Thanks, Darcy.
Thanks,
Thank
Darcy.
you.
Thank you.